Hello, everyone. I decided to do the last part, which is part 5, and the final chapters on camera. So, are y'all ready to find out whether Sydney survived or did Marshall kill her? And what is Grace going to do? Y'all ready? Here we go. Part 5, On the Road Again. Jury deliberation day 4. Harold stood next to the chalkboard. His hands were covered in a white, dusty coat of chalk. On the board was a detailed summary of the 3 previous days of deliberation. He had taken the morning to review meticulously their discussion from each day, making sure each juror was on the same page and that there was no confusion about the facts presented during the long trial. All right, refrigerator. It's now 3 o'clock on day 4. I think we've had a very careful and sometimes spirited discussion about the case. I know I've learned a great deal from listening to each of your opinions, and I hope my own views have helped shape our decision. When we sat down 4 days ago, we took an initial vote that had us nearly split in half. Today, after a careful review of the facts and unless there are objections, I propose we take our second vote to see where we stand as a group. To complete this process, we all know we must come to a unanimous decision. Are there any objections to conducting an open vote again now? There were not. Okay, Harold said, taking a seat at the head of the table. I'll need a show of hands. First, I'll ask who believes she is guilty. Then I'll ask who believes she is not guilty. Are we clear? All 12 agreed they were. Okay, here we go, y'all. Chapter 59, Thursday, September the 13th, 2018. Wait a minute, is this a whole year from now? Okay. The courtroom was standing room only. Each pew was packed shoulder to shoulder. The front pew held family and friends, those of the victim on one side, those of the accused on the other. The rest of the crowd was made of eager spectators that considered a spot in the courtroom more coveted than World Series tickets. Those standing in the back of the court were media. They not only clogged the rear walkway, but they also spilled out into the hallway. Those not lucky enough to gain access stood outside on the courthouse steps. Local news stations and every cable news program had cut into regular scheduled programming to bring the world the verdict live as it happened. After 4 days of sequestered deliberation, news had broken that the jury was back with a decision. Attorneys had been summoned, the judge was in chambers, the defendant was en route, and the jury members were being shuffled into the courthouse from their deliberation room. The participants had taken some time to assemble, which gave cable news a gratuitous hour to rehash the last 3 months of drama. Legal analysts, after witnessing closing arguments, had predicted the verdict would come immediately, perhaps after only a few hours of deliberation. But as the days passed, the experts predicted a hung jury. They all took to the airwaves now to offer new predictions. It was being called the trial of the young century, rivaling even the theatrics of the O.J. Simpson trial of the 90s. The famous line, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," from The Simpsons defense team had been replaced this century by the prosecution claim, if she did it in her past, it won't be her last. At 5:06 p.m., Judge Clarence Carter rapped his gavel to bring the court to order. The crowded courtroom quieted as the judge prepared his notes. Only the hum of the fans that had been brought in to help cool the room was audible. The judge gave the typical overview of how to conduct oneself in a court of law and warned that immediate removal by bailiffs would be ordered if anyone veered from this conduct. "Mr. Foreman," he finally said, "have you come to a unanimous decision?" "We have, Your Honor." A bailiff took the verdict from Harold Anthony and delivered it to the judge. "Will the defendant please rise?" Sitting at the defendant's table in one of the designer dresses that no longer hugged her body the way they used to, now baggy and loose from weight loss, was Ellie Reiser. What? It had been 14 months since Sydney's Ryan body was discovered poorly hidden in her apartment. Sydney died. A year since she was arrested for the murder, and 3 months since she first sat behind the defendant's table. She'd been released from her position at the hospital and had spent her life savings on her defense team. She stood. "Dr. Reiser, will you please face the jury?" Ellie turned with a somber expression and faced her peers. The judge turned to Harold Anthony. "Mr. Foreman?" Harold stood and read from his card. "Superior Court of New York, in the matter of the people of New York versus Ellie Margaret Reiser, we the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Ellie Margaret Reiser, guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree of Sydney Ryan." They put it on Ellie. The courtroom exploded with cheers and sobs, applause and moans. The judge rapped his gavel again. The crowd refused to quiet. Ellie put her hand over her gaunt cheeks and sank back down in her seat. Amid the commotion, a man stood from the back pew and limped gingerly out of the courtroom on his prosthetic until he was past the crowd of media people and in the hallway. Whoa. Chapter 60. Sunday, September the 16th, 2018. He hadn't been on the road for months. A steep learning curve came from driving with his left leg, but he felt there was nothing he could not conquer after ridding himself of the goddamn walker. And what better way to teach his left leg to the nuisance of pedal work than a 14-hour road trip? Now, out of the city and on the open road with the windows down and the breeze strong in his face, he felt damn good. Gus took the drive in 2 days, 4 shifts of 3 hours, give or take. It had been more than a year since he had bid adieu to the folks of Alcove Manor. During the grand ceremony of his departure, he even managed to hug Nurse Ratched on the way out, both smiling, but with looks that told another story. He had considered telling her to piss off, just a quiet whisper in her ear as she hugged him. He was sure a similar sentiment was on the tip of her tongue. Instead, when he had made it home, he lifted his prosthetic leg on his coffee table, popped a beer, and turned on the Yankees game. Between innings, he picked up the phone and ordered flowers for each nurse to whom he had been a complete asshole. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could do. He made the final 3-hour stretch of his journey without issue. He had resisted the urge during the past 2 days to push his driving time much past 3 hours. He still worked once a week with Jason, who had warned about sitting for too long, and Gus had learned over the last year to listen to what the kid had to say. It was Jason who had originally gotten his ass up and walking, and without that kid, Gus might still be lying in the rehab prison, relieving himself in a plastic jug. He found the hotel, checked in at the front desk, and politely turned down the young man's offer to help him with his bags. His limp was visible, but less prominent than the 3 months back. He had undergone his final fitting a month earlier when Jason completed the laser scanning technique that allowed for the final design of his prosthesis, and Gus was still getting to know his new leg. He had turned down the runner's option, which would produce a robotic type extension from his hip that would allow for more versatile mobility. You'll be a literal Robocop, Jason had told him. But Gus was no longer a cop, and agility hadn't been his strong suit when he had two functioning legs, so he saw no reason to attempt to achieve it with one. He chose the more practical solution of a carbon fiber hip socket and a 3R60 knee, which allowed him to walk with an almost normal gait that would improve with time and experience. The Autobot Triton foot, as opposed to the Robocop futuristic boomerang, was designed to allow him to wear a shoe that, when wearing pants, made him look like any other 69-year-old man. It had been more than a year since he lost his leg, and he was doing better than anyone had predicted. In his hotel room, he sat on the edge of the bed and removed his prosthesis. He rubbed his stump to relieve the pain, which still came from time to time. He sat back on the bed with his shoulders against the headboard, opening his fast food burger, popped a beer, and pulled the file folder from his bag. After an hour, he set the file aside, turned off the lights, and went to sleep. Chapter 61. Monday, September the 17th, 2018. He left the hotel at 9 o'clock the following morning and made the 30-minute drive into Atlanta. He found the police department headquarters on Peachtree Street and pulled into the parking lot. He flashed his retired detective badge at the gate attendant, who saw gold and waved him through without scrutiny. Gus found a parking spot, refusing to use the handicapped spot in the front row, and walked to the entrance. Gus Morale. Gus smiled as he managed the steps up to the front entrance. Jack Mack, he said when he reached the landing. They shook hands like the old friends they were. That a rental I saw you in? They don't rent rusty 92 Beamers. I drove down. I needed to get out of the city and on the road again. Yeah? John said. The long rides got you limping pretty good. Yeah, Gus said. 14 hours did a number on my back. Come on in, pal. I'll get you a coffee and show you what I found. Gus did his best to keep up with his old friend as John led him through the criminal investigation unit. The guts of the Atlanta Detective Department didn't look much different from New York, where Gus had spent the last decade of his career. After 20 minutes of touring, Gus finally sat down in front of John's desk. So, John said, pulling two boxes from the floor and placing them on his desk. This case you asked me about is more than 25 years old. Had a hell of a time pulling the boxes, but here they are. How much trouble will it be for me to have a look? John shrugged. I'm 9 months away from retirement. No one is expecting me to follow any rules, and letting an old colleague look at an ancient cold case isn't going to raise any eyebrows. Thanks, John. I'm just going to have to look to get myself up to speed on the details. Of course. Can I get you anything other than coffee? Yeah, Gus said. You know some lab guys who could help me out? Maybe. What do you need? Gus pulled an envelope from his pocket and carefully removed the tissues that was inside. He gently unfolded the corners to reveal the fingernail clippings. Oh, he's going to solve Sydney's father case. Oh. I need someone to run a DNA analysis on these and then compare them to what was found at the crime scene in here. Gus pointed to the box. I knew you were onto something when you called, John said. He looked down at the clippings. I could probably find a tech that could do it, but it ain't cheap. Don't worry about the cost. I'll cover everything. Someone cashing in on a favor you owe them? John asked. No, Gus said, I'm just making good on a promise. Oh. Chapter 62. Friday, September the 21st, 2018. His Atlanta road trip lasted nearly a week. 2 days after his return, Gus bellied up to the bar at Jim Brady's, a favorite Irish pub in Tribeca. Paul, the proprietor, was an old friend. They caught up over a pint of Genesis, calling each other Mick and Jenny more times than anyone around them cared to hear. They toasted to dust kicking cancer's ass. Let's hope it doesn't come back for another round, Gus said with a frosted lip. I've only got one leg left to kick it with. Well, my friend, Paul said, I hope you're finally able to enjoy your retirement. Nah, Gus said, this whole fiasco over the last year has shown me that I'm not the retiring type. You're not going back to the force, are you? Gus laughed. I'm 69 with one leg. No police force is taking me back, and I'm not interested. Gus reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, opened it up to show Paul the license inside. It wasn't quite as powerful as pulling out his badge, but it still felt good. Paul leaned over the bar. Private investigator. Passed the state exam last month, Gus said. What the hell is an over-the-hill retired detective going to investigate? A few cases from back in the day. They're calling me out of retirement. Paul lifted his pint. Maybe you'll stop in more often like the old days. Gus toasted his friend again. Maybe. Paul left to tend to other customers. Gus sipped his beer and ate a burger as he read the paper. He turned down the young bartender's offer to refill his pint and waited for the lunch crowd to thin before he pulled the file folder from his bag. It felt just like the old days, sipping a pint and digging for clues. He was no longer a cop, and his retired detective badge combined with his new PI license would only give him so many perks compared to the real thing. But he was also no longer on the clock, and he could choose what he spent his time on. He'd fulfill his promise to Sydney to look into her father's conviction. Oh. And he had plans to revisit the storage facility in the Bronx and dig through those old files that still haunted him. He was 69. He still had time. But before he dusted off cases from the past, there was another that was much more pressing. He spent an hour at the bar reading through the file. When he finished, he looked up at the television. Airing was a replay of the final episode of The Girl of Sugar Beach. A year after taking America by storm, the documentary was being rerun in prime time and replayed constantly during the day on the network's cable affiliate to correspond with Ellie Reiser's trial, which had just wrapped. In the wake of Sydney's death the previous year, the final 3 episodes were watched by tens of millions of viewers. The final installment, which showed Sydney welcoming Grace Sabol as she walked through the gates of Bordellos Correction Facility in St. Lucia's, and concluded with a shot of Grace Sabol standing on the Montauk Point Lighthouse as a free woman, arms outstretched, sweater like a cape in the breeze, had generated an audience of more than 60 million. The monstrous ratings were topped only by the recent trial that was connected to the documentary. Ellie Reiser's verdict aired live on every network late on Thursday evening, had been watched by more than 150 million people, matching the numbers produced when O.J. Simpson was found not guilty more than 20 years before. Gus kept his eyes on the television until the shot of Grace atop the lighthouse faded and the words appeared on the screen, "In loving memory of Sydney Ryan." Gus motioned to the bartender, "Give me 2 shots of whiskey, then close my tab." "Jameson? Johnny Walker?" Gus said. The bartender returned a minute later. Need another beer with these? The kid asked as he set the brimming shot in front of Gus. No thanks, just some privacy. The kid nodded and headed to the other end of the bar. Gus packed up his files and folded his newspaper. He stared at the mirror behind the bar, locked eyes with himself. Before cancer had found him, it was whiskey that had taken hold of his life. It hadn't been easy to admit, but the truth has a funny way of catching up to you when you spend 6 weeks in a hospital bed. He had decided his new life would come without the brown stuff, and he'd done well over the last year to stay away from it. But a bet is a bet, and today there was no way around it. He'd been close on his theory all those months ago. Close, but not quite right. And the circus trial that had taken place over the past few weeks had done little to convince him that the world was any closer to the truth about what had happened to the two boys who had loved Grace Bold. But with so many unanswered questions, he knew one thing for sure. He was wrong about what he'd written to Sydney months ago. Grace Bold didn't kill Henry Anderson. He was quite certain she didn't kill Julian either. He took his eyes from the mirror and looked down at the 2 shots of whiskey. He picked one up, brought it close to his lips. Cheers, kid, he whispered before he tipped it back and swallowed it down. He stood from the stool and took a moment to right himself on his prosthetics. Then he placed his empty shot glass next to the other. He stared down at the bar. Afternoon sun spilled through the front entrance and slanted across the mahogany. He looked at the 2 shot glasses, one full and one empty, tapped his fist twice against the railing, and limped out. As he pushed through the front door and into the afternoon sun, his cell phone rang. Gus pulled it out his pocket and looked at the display. Dr. Livy Cuddy. He'd been expecting her call. Gus placed the phone to his ear as he hobbled down the street. Hey, Doc, he said, you got those results for me? All right, this is the last chapter. Chapter 63. Friday, September the 21st, 2018. He took the 1 train from Jim Brady's to Brooklyn. He still had some contacts at the Metropolitan Detention Center and had called ahead to make arrangements. Gus was on no visitor log, so an old friend pulled some strings and didn't ask questions. It was a popular request, and the gesture did not go unnoticed. It would cost him a case of scotch, but was well worth it. When Gus walked up the subway stairs at 25th Street in Greenwood Heights, the sun was still bright and hot. He took the 5 blocks with confidence, stopping only once to give his stump a rest. When he made it to the front of the detention center, he stood tall and did his best to hide his limp. His friend met him at the entrance. Gus pretended not to notice the subtle glance at his prosthetic leg, and they both entered the prison. His friend cut through the red tape Gus would otherwise have had to endure. Within 10 minutes, he was sitting in a private visitation room made up of 4 chairs and a table. He was dressed casually in slacks and an Oxford button-down shirt. His bag rested on a table, and a snapshot of himself, seated with his hands folded as he waited, made the woman's first sentence logical when she entered the room. I don't need another lawyer, Ellie Reiser said. Mine are crappy enough. Good, 'cause I'm not a lawyer. Ellie sat across from him. She was wearing standard prison orange. Who are you then? I'm an old friend of Sydney Ryan's, Gus said. I'm also a detective. Used to be. I'm retired now, but I was working with Sydney when she died. Gus ran his tongue along the inside of his cheek. I actually think I was talking with her on the phone when she was killed. I knew the phone didn't hang up. Ellie shook her head. I had nothing to do with her death. I watched your trial, the whole circus, Gus said. I was one of the regulars that showed up every day in court and sat in the back row. He pulled the file from his bag, opened the folder, and placed it in front of him. Let me summarize the prosecution's argument against you. Sydney goes to your apartment. She discovers that, due to some irrational jealousy issue you have about Grace Abode, you killed not only Julian in St. Lucia's, but also Henry years before. The only two boys who ever loved her. When Sydney confronts you with her suspicions that Grace Sabo's love lock, which had for years been in your possession, was wrapped in a nylon bag and used to strike and kill both victims, you engaged in a confrontation with her. Ultimately, you did what you do best. You used the love lock to strike Sydney and kill her. If she did it in the past, it won't be her last. Do I have the argument correct? My attorney told me not to speak to anyone who showed up unannounced. You might change your mind when you hear what I have to tell you. Gus looked back to the files. Then there's the evidence, he said, and it's overwhelming. The blood in your high rise, which you poorly tried to clean up, the body hidden in the bathtub, the love lock stashed away in your drawer, the nylon bag that held it covered in blood. I can go on, but I think a body, blood, and murder weapon are sufficient. It certainly was for the jury that convicted you. Ellie continued to stare at him. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head and looked away. I know how it looks. And if you were Sydney's friend, I know what you must think about me. The entire world despises me, and I have no idea how any of this happened to her. Listen, I'm old, grouchy, and bored, Gus said. I'm also angry. He closed the file and held it up. Here's my problem with all of this. He reached over and took Ellie's hand, gave her a gentle squeeze. When she felt the gesture, she looked up to meet his eyes. Seeing the enemy, wait a minute, let me go back. When she felt the gesture, she looked up to meet his eye, seeing the enemy she thought was sitting in front of her morph suddenly into an ally. Gus offered a subtle smile. I don't believe it. Okay, y'all, that's the end of Don't Believe It. Well, I was hoping that Sydney wasn't dead. I was hoping that Derek would come to her rescue a little sooner and she would survive and she would end up in a coma in the hospital, and then she would be able to tell her story, and that Marshall and Grace was going to be on a run and Gus was going to help her find them. But as it turned out, Sydney died. They killed her, blamed it on Ellie, and they off and running. Woo wee! Let me tell you, that's some close-knit family crap. Oh, let me back up. I also thought that Grace was going to get tired of Marshall killing people on her behalf or his jealousy, and she was going to finally confront him to stop him. But as we see, no. She in it. She's a ride or die for real. She going to cover for him forever. Now, did y'all see that coming? Did y'all think that the book was going to end that way? If not, let me know what y'all think in the comment sections. Well, I didn't see that there was, whoa, wait a second. There's a book that says Long Time Gone, and then it's by the same, it's not, wait, yes it is. Hold on. I don't know. Is it a follow-up book to it? I just saw Dr. Cuddy's name in it, and I'm just like, is it a follow-up? But let me see. I don't know if I'm going to read it, but it says Long Time Gone, and it says Arthur of 20 Years Later. Well, that must be another book. But this is a sneak peek. In this engrossing, masterful, twisting new thriller from the #1 international best-selling author, a forensic trainee learned through a DNA test that she mysteriously disappeared as a baby 30 years ago, and her life is still in danger. Oh, no. It's not a continuation of Don't Believe It. It's just a totally new book. But yeah, that's the end of Don't Believe It. Feel free to let me know what you think about this book, what you thought about it, and I guess I might see you next month. But until then, y'all have a great day. Bye.